All right, for this brioche, you're going to start with 100 grams of whole milk. This milk can be straight from the fridge or room temperature. It doesn't really matter too much. Then add in 3 eggs to the same mixing bowl. It should be around 150 grams of eggs. If your eggs come out to under 150, you can just make up the difference with the same amount of milk. You're going to see me do that a little bit later in the video because my eggs weighed a little less than 150 grams. Add to this 40 grams of sugar, just plain white sugar, and then 10 grams of salt. Then go ahead and mix that all together. You just want to make sure the salt and sugar have a chance to dissolve a little bit. The next ingredient is the starter. You're going to add 150 grams of active and bubbling sourdough starter to the mix. Let me show you how I fed my starter. So the night before, I took my sourdough starter out of the fridge at about 50 grams leftover starter from the time before. I added 75 grams of water to this, and then I just stirred it all together so the starter would dissolve a little bit. Then I added 75 grams of bread flour. So 75 plus 75, that should give me 150 grams of starter for the next day and a little leftover. I just stirred everything together, marked the top with a rubber band, and the next morning my starter had completely doubled in size and it was ready to use. So go ahead and take that starter and stir it into the rest of your wet ingredients until it's completely dissolved. Then add 450 grams of bread flour. I'm using King Arthur brand bread flour. You could probably use their all-purpose flour if you want to, or something lower in protein, but I want as much protein and gluten development as I can for this brioche, so I prefer to use a higher protein bread flour. Basically just mix all of this together until there aren't any dry bits of flour left. At this point, I was mixing my dough and I could tell it was looking a little bit dry. And that's when I remembered my eggs were less than 150 grams, so I added a little bit more milk to get me up to that 150 mark. If you do this, just go ahead and keep stirring until the flour sucks up all of that milk and the dough kind of holds together. Basically, keep stirring until your dough looks something like this. Then turn your dough out onto the counter. But wait, you haven't added the butter yet! No worries, we're going to add the butter later after 8 to 10 minutes of kneading. You want to knead the dough first so that the butter doesn't impede the gluten development in the dough. This way, the brioche will turn out more like a bread and less like a cake. Alright, after at least 8 minutes of kneading, go ahead and cover up the dough and let it rest for 20 minutes. This will let the gluten relax a little bit and you'll be able to better incorporate the butter into the dough. Now go ahead and find 1 US stick of the highest quality butter you can find. This is a brand I like. You can use salted or unsalted for this recipe. It doesn't really matter. It can be kind of hard to incorporate butter into brioche by hand, but if we do it in 2 separate stages, it's a little bit easier. For the first stage, go ahead and take half of the butter, it should be softened, and just press it into the top of the dough with your fingers. You're just going to press and smear, and then you're going to dimple the butter into the dough, trying your best to just dimple it in before you do any stretching or kneading or anything like that. Then you're going to fold the dough over itself a few times, creating layers of butter throughout the dough. And what you're doing here is you're going to keep folding and folding and folding until the butter finally breaks through. The dough will kind of come apart and a layer of butter will bust through the edge of the dough. That's what I'm doing here. I'm just folding, continuing to fold until I see the butter burst out of the dough. Here's the point where that starts to happen. You notice as I fold, you can start to see the butter just peeking through and breaking through the layers of dough. So now what we have is dough with layers of butter inside. So we're going to need to knead the dough until it completely becomes one with the butter. You want the butter to be fully absorbed by the dough. So just keep kneading for about 5 to 10 minutes and make sure you have a bench scraper handy so you can clean up anything off of the counter. You're going to notice a few changes happening in the dough before you're done kneading. At first, you're going to notice that your counter gets really buttery. The butter just kind of leaks out of the dough and sticks onto the counter. That's kind of what you're seeing here. When that happens, just give it a few minutes, and once the butter becomes too much that you need to clean your counter off, just grab your bench scraper and clean it up. A bench scraper really comes in handy when making brioche by hand. Then the next thing you're going to notice that instead of your counter getting buttery, it's getting doughy. A lot of dough is starting to stick to the counter. And what that means is that the butter is starting to hold together into the dough. So the butter is being absorbed into the dough, but the dough isn't completely sticking to itself quite yet. If you're using a KitchenAid or some kind of stand mixer, the equivalent would be the dough like sticking to the sides of the bowl. That's basically what's happening right now. So you just need to keep kneading and kneading and kneading until the dough finally holds together and there aren't any doughy bits sticking to your counter. It might seem like this is never going to happen, but it will happen. Just keep kneading and the dough is going to hold together on its own. You can even clean up the counter with the dough, just like I'm doing here. You see? The dough is holding together and I'm not needing to clean up anything with my bench scraper anymore. Once you get to this point, you are done kneading and you can just kind of form your dough into a ball, then cover it up with that mixing bowl again and let it rest on the counter for 20 minutes. Then you're going to add the rest of the butter after that. So for the second butter addition, you are basically going to do the same thing as the first time, except now the dough already has some butter in it. I actually think that is a good thing. The dough is getting used to the butter and it'll be ready to accept some more. So go ahead, smear the butter on top, dimple it down with your fingers, and then same as last time, just fold the dough over itself, creating layers and layers of butter within the dough, and keep folding until you finally see butter start to break through the sides of the dough. Then just like last time, once you feel the butter start to break through, you're going to start kneading. This should take like 5, maybe 10 minutes, depending on how firmly you're able to knead by hand. Just keep kneading. At first, your counter is going to get really buttery. Just clean the butter on up with your bench scraper. And once you're past the buttery stage, your counter is going to start getting doughy. Just like last time, the dough stage is a good thing. That means the butter is soaking in to the dough. Then eventually, the dough will hold together. It'll start sticking to itself. If you're using a stand mixer, at this point, the dough would stop sticking to the sides of the bowl and it would hold together in the center. That's basically the same thing that's happening here by hand. And once your dough is fully kneaded, it should feel silky and smooth to the touch. Honestly, it's a pretty nice dough. It feels pretty nice. At this point, ball up your dough and cover it up with a mixing bowl and just let it rest for 5 minutes on the counter. Now, this is an optional step, but after 5 minutes, I like to do a window-pane test. I'm just going to take a chunk of the dough and I'm going to stretch it out really thin. I'm trying to stretch it out thin enough so that I can see through it without the dough breaking. And so right here, I can almost see through it, but my dough starts to break. That lets me know that I should knead the dough a little bit more to develop some more gluten. So if this happens to you, go ahead and knead your dough for just about 5 more minutes. After a few minutes of kneading, ball up the dough, cover it up again, and let it rest for another 5 minutes before checking on the window pane one more time. Take off another chunk of the dough, stretch it out thin, and you want to basically be able to see light through the dough. That's why they call this the window pane test. If you see light through the dough, it's ready to go. Yeah, okay, forget I said that. At this point, ball the dough up and move it to some kind of bowl. I like a glass bowl so that I can see through the sides and I can see how much the dough is growing. I like to butter the bowl with a little of that excess butter and then transfer the dough into the bowl, close it up with the lid, and then let the dough bulk ferment or rise on your counter for about 5 to 10 hours. You want to see the dough double in size. At the end of 10 hours, this is what my dough looked like. It's completely doubled, probably past doubled, honestly. At this point, you have a few options. You can shape the dough right now in the pan if you've got time to let it proof, or if you don't have time, you can put this dough in your fridge for up to 24 hours to kind of put it on pause. That's what I like to do because when you take the dough out of the fridge, it's a lot more firm and the dough is easier to shape. Especially with a buttery dough like brioche, I like it to be nice and easy to shape. Go ahead and get your favorite bread pan. This is my favorite one. It's a non-stick version from USA Pans. I use it in probably all of my sandwich loaves. Now go ahead and take your dough out of the bowl with a bowl scraper and it's ready to shape. The way that I like to shape my brioche is by dividing it equally into 6 equally sized balls and then putting those into the loaf pan. So I'm taking the full weight of my dough and dividing that by 6. You can use a digital scale for this if you want to get exactly even sized pieces, or you can just cut your dough into 6 pieces and hope for the best. It's really not a big deal. Honestly, I think people make too big of a deal out of things like that sometimes, but it does look pretty cool when all the pieces are the same exact size. So I prefer to use a digital scale. Do whatever you want though. Once your dough balls are divided equally into 6 pieces, go ahead and form them into actual balls. You're going to need to kind of stretch and fold the dough into the center and then shape the dough into a ball like this with your hand. This creates surface tension across the top of the dough and smooths it out into a nice smooth ball. Go ahead and repeat that process with each of the dough balls. I'm going to kind of speed up the process so you can see it. This is a very similar method that people use for shaping hamburger buns or dinner rolls. So you might have seen that in my dinner roll video from last year. Once your dough balls are shaped, it's time to put them into the pan. This is my trick for fitting these 6 dough balls into the small pan. Squeeze one of the balls into the corner, then take the second one and press it between your hands so that it fits, and then shimmy it down there with your dough scraper, your bowl scraper. And you kind of use that plastic scraper to make the 2 dough balls fit. Then the same thing with the third and fourth piece of dough. Press them against the side or between your hands to make them fit. And this is when the cold dough really helps you in the shaping. Warm or room temperature dough would be a lot harder to fit into the pan at this point. Then these last 2 pieces of dough are the hardest ones to fit into the pan because you are running out of room on all sides. But use your fingers and a plastic dough scraper to your advantage. It'll really come in handy at this point. Squeeze the dough into the side of the pan. And then for the last piece, make sure you squeeze it as small as you can. And then with your bowl scraper, slide the dough down into the pan as far as it will go. And with the cold dough, you can even press it down with your hands a little bit. Don't be afraid of squishing these down because you don't need big air bubbles in a brioche anyway. So with your 6 dough balls in place, now it's time to let this dough proof or go through its second rise. I like to oil a little bit of plastic wrap. The plastic is going to cover up the dough and the oil is going to keep the plastic from sticking to the dough. If you just want to use a kitchen towel to cover up your dough, that is completely fine. Just make sure you cover up the dough tightly so that air can't get inside, and let the dough proof for 6 to 8 hours or until doubled in size like this. There you go. Probably more than doubled in size, honestly. This is nice and puffy. Just gonna lightly brush the top of the whole loaf with this egg wash. This gives the brioche that classic dark brown crust, and it's gonna look a lot shinier when you do this. If you've ever seen a brioche that just looks kind of dull, then it probably didn't have an egg wash on top. So don't skip this step. I mean, you can if you want to, but don't. There we go. This brioche is ready for the oven. Okay, then bake this in the middle rack of your oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for about 30 to 40 minutes. I'm gonna check it at 30 and see if it needs to be a little darker. I'll go from there. Okay, after 30 minutes, I'm checking the internal temperature of this bread, and it's just not quite done yet. It should be around 190 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm gonna bake this for another 10 minutes and then see what the temperature is. All right, and 10 minutes later, my bread looked good. I didn't even take the temperature just because I knew it was gonna be 190 degrees Fahrenheit at least. And this is how the bread looked, nice and golden brown. I'm gonna give this about 1 hour to cool on the cooling rack, and then I'll pull it apart and show you how it looks. Now on YouTube, you are contractually obligated to show a crumb shot of any bread that you bake. So here's a crumb shot of this sourdough brioche. And I think brioche is particularly interesting on the inside, so let's take a look. This is what a lot of people do to brioche. I'm really not sure why, but it does look pretty cool. You can kind of peel back just little pieces of the brioche. It's bready, but it's still really flaky and tender on the inside. And because I shaped this as 6 individual little pieces of dough, they kind of fuse together, but they can break apart really easily just like this. I think that's pretty cool, even though it's not very functional. You can eat brioche plain with some butter and jelly or jam, whatever you want. This bread is also really good toasted, so I'm going to take a slice here and take it to the toaster and show you what a slice looks like toasted. And actually, I want you to listen to what it sounds like. Delicious, buttery sourdough brioche. I really hope you give this recipe a try. You can find the recipe at the link in the description. I'll see you in the next video.